Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Competitive Intelligence Community of SLA's featured webinar titled 4 Structured Analytical Techniques Every Analyst Must Know, featuring Dr. Ken Sawka. My name is Lauren Kenny, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm a program manager at Aurora WDC, and Aurora is honored to be a longtime sponsor of the SLA CIC webinar series. I just want to start off today by saying that today's webinar is just a part of the amazing content that the SLA CI community produces. In addition to this ongoing webinar program, the CIC is planning a fantastic lineup of presentations for SLA's virtual conference this year, and we hope that you'll be able to take part this August. Next slide, please. Just a few announcements before we dive into today's content. First, we're taking a page from the SLA headquarters book with Member Monday Spotlights. We want to get to know you better and help facilitate connections within the CI community. This is your chance to share how being a CIC member has enhanced your professional life. You can tell us your favorite webinar topics and takeaways, or pass on any advice that you'd like to share with those of us in the CI community. Please look for a link in the chat pane and use this brief form to share your story and perspectives. Next slide, please. We also want to hear about how we can help enhance your CI toolkit. So after today's webinar, where Ken will discuss 4 hand-picked analytical techniques, what would you like to see next? We'd love if you would take a moment to tell us. Please submit your response in the questions pane. Next slide. This is a reminder that registration is now open for SLA's annual conference. It is a virtual interactive experience being held August 4th through 13th. So just click the link in the chat to learn more and save the date. Also coming up is another CI Toolkit webinar. In May, we'll be tackling one of the most well-known techniques out there, SWOT analysis. So stay tuned to SLA CIC email and social media channels to find out more in the coming days. Next slide, please. We'd like to thank you all for taking valuable time out of your day to join the webinar and participate in today's discussion. One lucky attendee today will be randomly selected to win $25. Here's what a last month's winner had to say about the financial analysis presentation. Fantastic, much clearer and succinct than anything I have heard from my finance profs. Well, we appreciate that feedback and stay tuned to see if you're the lucky winner. Next slide, please. Lastly, as you enjoy the webinar content, we encourage you to take to Twitter and use hashtag CICwebinar to share insights from today's discussion and keep the conversation going. Next slide, please. I now have the privilege of introducing Dr. Ken Sawka. Ken is a principal at Point Advisory and leads the firm's healthcare practice. Ken has more than 25 years of experience as an intelligence analyst in both government and private sector. He's one of the CI field's practice and thought leaders, and he's both instructed and written on applying analytical methods such as ACH often. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ken.
Great, thank you, Lauren, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever folks may be. Really happy to be here, and thanks to SLA and the CIC for inviting me to present on the webinar today. This came out of a call I received from Dr. Craig Flesher, who has the memory of an elephant, and said, Ken, remember you wrote a series of articles almost 15 years ago on the 4 structured analytic techniques every analyst should know. Would you want to do a webinar for the SLA on those techniques? And I said, sure, but Craig, you got to send me those articles because I can't recall what those 4 techniques were. And so he was kind enough to do so, and I read them, and I said to myself, these aren't the right techniques anymore. So went back and thought through some of the techniques that I've been using, both with my graduate students, with my clients, and just in my own work, and change them up a bit. So, you know, what was relevant and important 15 years ago isn't so much anymore, and I guess that shouldn't be a surprise to any of us. But I do want to go through what I think are the 4 structured techniques that are most important for today's competitive analysis, and hopefully this will be a good introduction or maybe a refresher for many of you on some of these analytic techniques. But let me start by asking, why do we need structured techniques in the first place? Many of us are experts in specific industries or with specific organizations or competitors, and there's a certain intuitiveness that comes from that level of expertise, so that if we look at intelligence reporting, if we look at data, our lived experience doing this kind of work for some period of time theoretically should be enough to draw analytic conclusions and judgments for our intelligence consumers. And that's often the case, but the problem is those judgments and that intuition is often affected by cognitive imperfections that we as humans have that makes doing objective, critical intelligence analysis very difficult. And I'll talk about some of those cognitive imperfections in a minute. The other challenges we face as intelligence analysts is the markets and industries that we examine are complex and becoming more so day by day and year by year. And that complexity runs counter to how we look for historic patterns in the analysis we do, and makes it very challenging sometimes for analysts to interpret information or signals or indicators that we have never seen before. And so these structured techniques help us deal with that. And in some cases, we're dealing with either incomplete or ambiguous or contradictory information. And this has actually grown as a larger problem as the availability of information continues to exponentially grow. We have much more information to wade through to get to that which is truly diagnostic. And that can challenge, the ability to do good objective intelligence analysis. To compensate for all that, we as analysts bring our own mental models to the table when we conduct analysis. And these models can be beneficial to the analysis process. They can also be quite detrimental. So on the positive side, our mental models help us process large volumes of information quickly based on those patterns that we've seen in the past. But they also, at the same time, blind us to new developments, and they often force us to assimilate new information into those existing models, and that creates conflict. It's very hard for us to do that, and that leads to incorrect analysis and ultimately to intelligence failures. In addition, we often either reject or ignore or minimize information that doesn't fit in those historic mental models that we bring to this kind of analytic work. So these structured analytic techniques are meant to address that and try to counter that. The other challenge that we face is that we bring perceptual and cognitive biases to analytic work. And these four categories of biases that you see here were identified by an individual called Richard Hoyer. He wrote a seminal book back in 1999 called The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, which really does a much better job than I'm doing here of laying the case for why structured analytic techniques and a critical thinking approach to intelligence analysis is important. And in Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, he hits on these four different types of biases. I won't go through each one in detail, but some things to highlight here. In the area of perceptual biases, Hoyer contends that we basically, as individuals and as analysts, perceive what we expect to perceive. That is, we'll look at a body of data and pull out of it what we think we ought to be seeing, or what we expect to see, again, based on that past experience. And unfortunately, it's the addition of unambiguous information that we need to recognize unexpected phenomenon, but we're trained, we're sort of primed to be looking for something else that makes looking for change in certain situations quite difficult. In terms of bias related to the evaluation of evidence, we are looking for consistency. We're looking for conclusions that we'd rather draw from a small body of consistent information rather than engendering more confidence in a larger body of information that is perhaps less consistent with what we expect to see in the past. We also don't do a very good job as individuals in terms of estimating probabilities, and we bring a strong bias to that exercise. Many of you have probably heard of the availability bias, of anchoring, where our estimates of probability and likelihood are influenced either by how easily we can imagine an event or recall similar instances in the past, this notion of vividness, or whether estimates about the likelihood or probability of certain events are adjusted only incrementally in response to new information or further analysis. We're sort of weighed by key pieces of information from prior experience that influence and essentially anchor us to incorrect estimates of probability or the inability to forecast effectively. And then last, we bring a bias in perceiving causality. We're trained and we want to look for patterns in sets of data. And it's very, very hard for analysts to claim or to conclude that data sets that we're seeing are in fact random. And we're looking for patterns in causality that really just don't exist. So these structured techniques are meant to address not only these perceptual and cognitive biases, but also that perception and mental model that we, again, based on our lived experiences, bring to analytic work. So what I've done in terms of updating the work that Dr. Flesher sent me from 15 years ago is to identify what I think today are the 4 most important structured analytic techniques that intelligence analysts ought to know. And they are first, the key assumptions check technique, indicators of change, the analysis of competing hypotheses, and alternative futures analysis. Now, these are by no means the only 4. There are dozens of these sorts of structured analytic techniques available, many of which have been sort of developed and applied and perfected over time in the government intelligence community, which is where I learned many of these. And these are a body of structured analytic techniques that are separate from and differentiated from common business strategy techniques like Porter's 5 Forces or SWOT. Not that it's a choice between one or the other, those techniques are very complementary. But what I wanted to do today is focus on a set of techniques that are probably somewhat less well known in the intelligence and analysis community, or at least the business intelligence analysis community, and hopefully give you, again, either an introduction or perhaps a refresher on these techniques in the hope that you'll find them beneficial in your work in intelligence analysis. Before we get into the first technique, though, I wanted to just take the audience's temperature on how often you're using structured analytic techniques. So I'll turn it back to Laura now to launch this poll.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, we've got the poll launched, so really interested to see what the audience has to say. It looks like we're at 40% voted, which is awesome. Let's see if we can get to 75%. Oh, wow, okay, we're getting there already. We're at 71% voted, so we will close the polls soon. Give everybody a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And looking at the results, it looks like occasionally and frequently, but we have a strong percent, 37%, who've never used these structured analytic techniques. Turn it back to you, Ken. What are your thoughts?
Great. No, that's interesting. I'm glad to see that there's such a high percentage that are in that at least occasionally or frequently, more than half the votes. So that's encouraging. Somewhat what I expected. I think there is some awareness or familiarity with these techniques, but maybe not to the extent that individuals are applying or using them frequently. For the 4% who picked always, that's awesome. Really glad to see that. But it's helpful because it'll help me sort of guide sort of how I present these and, you know, make sure I provide some additional resources for you at the end of the webinar where you can go to learn about these techniques potentially in more detail. So let's dive in. And what I'll do is present the first 2 techniques. We'll take a short break for some Q&A. Then I'll present the second 2, wrap things up, and we'll have another opportunity for Q&A. So as I go through the first two, if you have questions, put them in the questions segment on the webinar. Lauren will keep tabs and we'll hit a few of them when we get past the second technique. So first one is a key assumptions check. This is a really valuable technique, one that seems deceptively simple on the outset, but when you take the time to do it and apply it, can really be informative in terms of helping analysts understand those often unspoken assumptions that, whether we know it or not, have a strong influence in how we analyze certain competitive situations or evaluate and interpret data. So the goal here with this technique is to make those assumptions explicit and identify what information or developments would require that we rethink them or reconsider them. And in many cases, assumptions go unchallenged for months or even years. And of course, as the complexity of competitive markets continues to intensify, those assumptions become invalid. They become obsolete over time. So it's important to go through a fairly explicit and structured process, not only to identify the assumptions on which our analysis is resting, but also to make sure they are still valid and see if we can point to evidence or data or information to essentially validate them and assure ourselves that they are in fact still relevant and still important. So the technique starts with just reviewing what is the current analytical line on a specific issue. To give a very simple example, if you're looking at a specific competitor and have the prevailing analytic sentiment that that competitor manufactures product with a lower cost basis than your organization does, that's your starting point. You want to write that down and use that as the basis to then ask, what are the premises that we either have stated explicitly or that we sort of just accept inherently, which we accept as true for that analytic line to be valid. And so you want to list all the different reasons why you believe that competitor has a lower cost basis for manufacturing than your organization does. And then go to challenge each assumption. Ask yourself why that assumption must be true and whether it's valid under all conditions. That competitor may have a lower cost basis for the manufacture of certain products, but not for others. Perhaps their R&D costs are higher than industry norms. So you want to really break that current analytic line and the assumptions that are undergirding it, and really make sure you're identifying assumptions that continue to be valid and why those must be valid for that analytic line to continue to be accurate and representative of your estimation and your judgments on that competitor. And then finally, you want to go through and refine that list of assumptions so that you're only isolating and working on those that must be true and that you have a high degree of confidence are true, either based on experience or on actual data or evidence. And I think when you do this, you'll be surprised as to how many assumptions you actually wind up taking off the list, assumptions that are either not so important to supporting that main analytic judgment or that have become obsolete over time and are just simply not well supported by available evidence or by the experiences and observations that you and others have in the industry, in the market, or on specific competitors. And as you go through the process, you want to be asking yourself what the degree of confidence is in your judgment that a certain assumption is correct. What explains the degree of confidence you have in that assumption? Why do you feel so certain or perhaps so uncertain about it? What information that you might be able to collect could undermine or force you to change the assumption, and where might you go to find it? And are the assumptions you listed actually more akin to a key uncertainty or a key factor that you need to understand and learn more about in order to complete that analysis? So in addition to sort of challenging these older and perhaps obsolete assumptions, it also makes sure you are in fact dealing with assumptions and not uncertainties or factors or forces, which are some degree different than assumptions, at least in this context. And what I found in using this technique is it does deliver a number of benefits. I think of the half dozen listed here, that first one, in terms of being able to better explain the logic of the analytic argument and expose potentially faulty logic, is really valuable not only for an analyst or an analytic team working on an analytic project, but also when you go to present to your intelligence users and consumers in your organization what assumptions your analysis was based on, and the ability to demonstrate how you looked at and revisited and even challenged those assumptions to strengthen the veracity and the confidence that you have in your analytic conclusions. I think this notion of uncovering hidden relationships, the fourth item on this list, and the links between key factors is an interesting outcome from this approach. Just by going through and listing assumptions, you begin to see those connections and those relationships, and you can pinpoint if you were to question or eliminate or challenge one assumption, what other assumptions sort of rest on that core one, and then must also be challenged or reconsidered or even eliminated. And then last, I think this technique is also good at preparing analysts for changed conditions. If we have a high degree of assumptions that we no longer have confidence in terms of their veracity or their accuracy, that's an indication that we're in potentially a more volatile situation with regard to the situation that is under analysis or under inspection at this point in time. It may influence your intelligence gathering techniques. It may affect your generation of hypotheses. It's probably going to affect the message that you convey to your intelligence consumers, because you're sort of gaining more proof and more evidence that you are in fact in potentially a more uncertain or a more volatile situation. The second technique that I wanted to cover is indicators of change. Again, one that on the surface I think might seem pretty intuitive or pretty apparent, but when you take a more structured approach to it, I think it can reveal some really interesting analytic conclusions, and again, just bring more structure and more order to your analysis. And so for me, this is a structured technique that's about diagnosticity. It's about making sure that I am orienting my intelligence gathering approaches or mechanisms or techniques to be able to collect the most relevant, the most diagnostic, the most indicative information that I can in terms of trying to track how a particular industry trend or set of phenomena are developing and where it might be going in the future. We're often called as analysts to try to anticipate or even predict future events. We know, of course, that trying to predict the future is impossible and kind of a futile effort. But with a technique like this, we can increase the confidence that we have in our projections or how we anticipate what is likely to happen or develop next with regard to industry trends, players in the industry, and other phenomena. And we do that by explicitly listing the observable events or developments or circumstances that we would expect to see if a postulated situation is developing. Great example is if we're concerned about consolidation in an industry, and we have a sense that two or more players in a market or in an industry, could form a partnership or merge. What are the things that we would expect to see that would be diagnostic in terms of giving us more confidence that that merger or that partnership is in fact becoming more likely, and to make sure we are oriented at indicators that we can collect through legal and ethical intelligence gathering mechanisms, and know which events, which observations we can discount because they don't meet that threshold of diagnosticity. Earlier, I talked about the abundance of information that we're trying to wade through as analysts. This technique is very useful in making sure we're spending our time and effort not only gathering, but paying attention to the most diagnostic and the most relevant indicators of future developments or events. So we start by identifying a set of competing hypotheses or scenarios. The next two techniques are going to go into how we do that in a bit more detail, but we're trying to identify and write down what are the things that we are expecting in the markets or industries that we're analyzing. And then create separate lists of potential activities, statements, events, observations that we might expect to see for each of those hypotheses or scenarios. And for each one, you want to ask, am I likely to see this? Am I likely to observe it? Is this something that will be in the public domain or that my human sources are going to have access to? Because we don't want to create a giant indicator list of indicators that we have very little chance of actually observing because it's proprietary or confidential information, or the cost might be too high to collect it. So it's a good check on the effectiveness of our intelligence collection. And we want to make sure that it is diagnostic. It is something that, were we to see it, we would place a considerable amount of attention and relevance to it in terms of being to anticipate those future events and future outcomes. We want to then regularly review and update that indicator list to see which ones are changing, to cross off the ones we've observed. And as we see more events and indicators occur, that's going to fuel our thinking on additional indicators that we might see from that point forward. And then based on that, identify the most valid hypotheses or scenarios based on the number of changed indicators that we have observed. So it just puts structure to a technique that I think many of us do somewhat intuitively, but it makes the indicators collection and analysis, I think, much more efficient than doing it absent a structured approach like this. And so the benefits, I think, are quite significant. It is certainly a way to increase analytic confidence that a postulated situation is or isn't developing. We'll be able to know earlier and with more certainty that something is or is not going to manifest or develop in the market. It's a good way to build not just evidence, but the best evidence, the most relevant and diagnostic evidence to support a specific hypothesis. That's particularly important if we are in a position to have to warn about what might be considered a low probability event by our intelligence consumers. You need to build a stronger body of evidence to be able to make a case for that future event and the likelihood that it could occur. I think this technique is very good in terms of generating hypotheses, which again is going to feed the next two techniques that we talk about. And it opens our analysis to scrutiny by others. This is a great technique to be somewhat transparent with, either with peers or colleagues in your organization or with your intelligence consumers, so that they can see what indicators you thought were most meaningful, which ones you thought were most observable. And those other colleagues and consumers will often have opinions and input into the development of those indicator lists. So it really is a nice technique on which to build some analytic transparency, which frankly is never a bad thing. So let me take a brief pause, maybe, Lauren, for about 5 minutes and see if any questions have come up in the question segment in the webinar. Happy to address a couple before we move on to the next set of techniques.
Fantastic. Yes, we've got some great audience questions rolling in, so thank you to all who've submitted. To start, Ken, what is a good way to address degree of confidence? Most leaders want an empirical basis, but often we fall back on a feeling. How do we approach this?
That's a great question, and I wish it was one I had a better answer to than what I'm going to give you. So there's a real fine line we have to walk as analysts. Most of the work, not all, but most of the work we do is qualitative in nature, right? This isn't high sample size survey research. It's more small sample size, qualitative information gathering. So empiricism is very difficult. I've had individuals, both in my government career and my private sector career, suggest to me that despite the fact that the information gathering is qualitative, to still try to ascribe quantitative measures of confidence to judgments. We have a 60% certainty about this judgment. That's really dangerous because it's communicating what is essentially a false precision on the degree of confidence that you actually have based on the information you've gathered. So one thing that I've done and I've recommended in the past is to actually create a framework or a rubric that ties descriptions of confidence levels to qualitative descriptions. So when you write in an intelligence report, we believe the merger of the two competitors is highly likely. What does highly likely mean? It's a little bit of a squishy term, but it avoids that false precision of trying to quantify confidence. If you have written down somewhere, highly likely means we have heard evidence of this from 5 independent sources, or the likelihood of that development fits prior patterns that we have observed, and we are seeing comparable indicators against those prior patterns to suggest that this is likely to happen. It gives some degree of at least an understanding of what highly likely or somewhat likely or highly unlikely means in your description. So come up with those qualitative descriptors of confidence and write down what they mean in terms of the veracity of the evidence behind those judgments.
That's great, thanks. I think that actually addresses a couple other questions we got in. The next one is related to key assumptions check. What do we do if some of the assumptions we identified are inviolable truths within our organization, things that should not be challenged?
So tread carefully is my first response. That can be hard, right? Because so often the wishes or preferences of our intelligence consumers trickle down and do have some indirect influence on our analytic performance, right? And so to kind of reverse the example I used, if it's sort of an inviolable truth that your organization is the low-cost manufacturer in the industry, and the assumptions that you've arrayed to look at that don't quite hold water, boy, that's a tough one, right? To bring up the chain and to try to challenge internally. Or if there are strong sentiments about the competitive positioning of other competitors. It's interesting, many organizations actually tend to overshoot their belief about the strength and direct competitive positioning of competitors, which can be a good situation to deploy a technique like this in. But if they're really, inviolable or deeply held truths, it just increases the importance of arraying a very, very good case as to why you believe maybe that assumption isn't necessarily completely invalid, but at least why it requires a higher degree of scrutiny. So if you're able to identify what those sacred cows and inviolable truths are, maybe stop short of saying these assumptions are invalid or we are rejecting them, but start by saying we have reason to want to at least reconsider or challenge these assumptions. Here are those reasons, and if you can point to actual evidence, that's better. And then sort of make a promise to come back and say, we'll come back and report on what we found in our challenge to these assumptions to see if it's something maybe we should minimize in terms of how we consider them based on their importance to the analytic conclusions that we're trying to draw. But it's very risky. It can be very challenging.
Sure, that's great advice. I think we have time for one more question before we move on. One attendee said, I love the use of hypotheses, but how large is the team that builds the hypotheses? In my experience, having a large team work on them is difficult.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And actually, it's a great segue into the next technique on the analysis of competing hypotheses. But to address the question now, again, it's a little bit of a balance and a nuance. I really don't have a hard and fast rule. It is possible to be an army of one and come up with a hypothesis set for a particular problem on your own, and then maybe socialize that set of hypotheses individually and independently with a number of colleagues, and those individuals that you choose to share with and get input from, can be quite large if you're doing it sort of one at a time on a one-off basis. In terms of a group setting, I'd be hesitant to bring any more than maybe 4 or 5 people into a room or these days a virtual room to go through some hypothesis brainstorming. You want to try to structure that so there is a way to do structured brainstorming sessions, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. That's good practice to put some order to those conversations. But yeah, 4 or 5 is probably a good number, but don't let that stop you from taking a hypothesis set and then sharing it individually with, frankly, as many people as you want, and that should also at times include your intelligence consumers. I mean, leadership and decision makers can often have an interesting approach to hypothesis generation based on their perspective on a market that analysts may not be able to come up with on their own.
Great, that's fantastic. And thanks again to everyone who submitted questions. If we don't get to them now, we're going to do another Q&A after the next two techniques and see how much time we have at the end. So thanks again, and pass it back to you, Ken.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Thank for those questions. Those were terrific. So let me move into the third, which again, perfect segue from that last question, the analysis of competing hypotheses. This is one as a young government intelligence analyst was, one of the first techniques I learned, and it really has withstood the test of time. It's one that I teach in some of my graduate teaching at Northeastern University, and it's a really, really versatile technique. The premise here is to address two problems in how individuals typically evaluate hypotheses. The first problem is we normally will look at a set of hypotheses and evaluate them sequentially. We'll sort of take hypothesis one, look at the data that we've gathered or the evidence that we've gathered, and make a conclusion, that one doesn't quite have the evidentiary support I'd like it to have. Then we'll do the next one. And when we get to the one that we think is it, like, hey, this one looks really good in terms of the amount of meaningful information that is available to support it, we may well stop there. Like, those other hypotheses I haven't considered can't possibly be as good as this one. And Richard Hoyer, the Psychology of Intelligence Analysis author, has a term for this. He calls it satisficing. It's essentially analysts coming to what they think is the best explanation for a particular data set or set of phenomena without having to necessarily go through the hard work of evaluating all the possibilities that could exist, hypothetically, to explain a particular data set. So this technique helps address that. The second is it actually flips on its head how we assign veracity and validity to hypotheses. So in the prior technique, in indicators of change, we talked about indicators that were lending support to our scenarios or hypotheses. This technique goes the other direction. And what we actually want to do with this is look at hypotheses against the data we've collected and find the highest amount of disconfirming information for each hypothesis, so that we use this exercise not to identify the one hypothesis with the most support, but to identify the one or several hypotheses that we can pretty confidently reject because of disconfirming evidence. And think about why that's a really good analytic approach. I mean, in many cases, you can really never conclusively prove a hypothesis based on the abundance of information that supports it. In some cases you can, but do we really know we have covered the waterfront in terms of all the relevant information needed to, even with a very high degree of confidence, confirm a hypothesis? But how many pieces of good diagnostic evidence does it take to refute or disconfirm a hypothesis? Just one. And the best example of this is if we hypothesize that there are only white swans in the entire world, we can look and see hundreds of thousands of white swans and be very confident in that hypothesis. But the day we see one black swan, we know that hypothesis is invalid. So there's a lot more analytic power to demonstrating to your intelligence consumers how you arrived at the best possible explanation by showing how you eliminated other possible explanations. It's a good case of abductive reasoning that really brings a lot of analytic horsepower to your work. This is a very, very simplified process map for analysis of competing hypotheses. You want to start with identifying a MECE hypothesis set. MECE stands for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And back to the question about how many individuals to bring to the table to generate hypotheses, to get to that MECE condition, it is beneficial to bring others in. It's hard for just one person to do this. mutually exclusive, find the right set of hypotheses that have virtually no overlap with each other. You want those hypotheses to be as distinct from each other as possible. And collectively exhaustive, you really want to try to cover the waterfront, all the possible explanations that we can think of to be able to come up with possible explanations for the analytic problem we're looking at. Another great book that talks about the MECE approach is The Pyramid Principle by Barbara Minto. Again, a book that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Good one to have on your shelf that gets into more about how to be MECE when you do this hypothesis generation. Then you want to create a matrix. You want to list those hypotheses along the top, and you want to list your relevant evidence, pieces of data or categories of data down the left-hand column, and then draw a relationship map. Essentially say for each hypothesis, is each piece of data consistent with or inconsistent with that hypothesis? And you want to either use a plus minus indicator on the matrix or a C or an I, whatever you want, it doesn't matter. And then add up the number of inconsistent pieces of evidence for each hypothesis. And look at the hypotheses with the highest number of inconsistent pieces of evidence and question them. Can we eliminate this hypothesis from consideration? Is there a really damning piece of evidence that just completely refutes this hypothesis, so that we're left with a much smaller set of hypotheses that we can't refute and therefore want to give consideration to in terms of what is the best possible explanation for the problem or the data set that we're examining. So it forces us to eliminate from consideration pieces of evidence that have no diagnostic relationship. When I do this matrix, I often find myself saying there's a piece of evidence here that is neither inconsistent or consistent with a hypothesis. It has no diagnostic value. I'm just going to eliminate it. It's not important, it's not relevant for my consideration of these hypotheses. It also lets us look for pieces of evidence that may be overweighted in terms of their relationship, either in terms of being highly inconsistent or highly consistent with one or more hypotheses. And again, back to the earlier question, it's a way, it's a framework to bring other analysts or even intelligence consumers into the process to both generate the hypotheses or review the available evidence. And so there are a number of benefits that are associated with this technique. Again, I think the biggest one is it avoids, number two here, that notion of satisficing based on Hoyer's terminology. It lets us counter analytic bias toward evidence that supports a preferred hypothesis, no matter how objective we try to be. We probably have either an implicit or an explicit preference for one or maybe a couple of hypotheses. This forces us to look at evidence more agnostically and try to get over those preferences or those hypotheses biases that we might have. And again, like the prior technique, it opens the analysis to scrutiny. If you can show your intelligence consumers that you've arrived at a conclusion or an explanation based in part by first eliminating other possible explanations from consideration, really, really magnifies the credibility and the power of that analysis, especially if your consumers had a preference for one of those hypotheses that you wound up eliminating. And you can show that individual based on the data why that hypothesis just doesn't hold water. So it really adds analytic strength and confidence to this work. The last one is alternative futures analysis. This is also known as scenario analysis, one that can be used in a number of ways, either as a very simple analytic technique or as the basis for long-range strategic planning. I'm going to look at this more in the former application as an analytic technique because it has a lot of relationships and is complementary to the other techniques that we've talked about. So when we're looking at situations where there's a high degree of uncertainty, where there's not a lot of clarity in terms of how a particular situation might evolve, if we're being pressured to try to come up with a forecast or anticipate how competitors or customers or partners or industries are going to behave in the future. This is a technique that gets us away from probabilistic evaluations of future outcomes and instead focuses us on plausibility, the chance that something could happen, not that it may happen. And that's important for a number of reasons that I'll touch on as we go through this. But this technique also helps us model uncertainty. It's a way to avoid just kind of throwing our hands up in the air and saying, there's just too much complexity and volatility and uncertainty here. I don't know where to start. This gives us a framework to try to model that uncertainty, and in doing so, can help spark some really creative thinking about describing plausible scenarios, plausible alternative futures about how things could develop, and to help develop contingency plans should aspects of any of those alternative futures actually come through. So like with other techniques, we want to start by brainstorming not necessarily those scenarios, but what are the forces, the factors, the trends that will affect the future of whatever the issue is that we're talking about. So again, if we're looking at the plausibility or the possibility of industry consolidation, what are the variables? What are the forces and factors? There could be cost pressures in the industry. There could be declining consumer demand for a particular segment of products or services. There could be higher regulatory burdens that demand more efficiency by the participants in a particular industry. So you want to identify what those variable forces and factors are, and then select, ideally by consensus. This is a really good group technique. I usually want to pick anywhere from 2 to 5 of the most critical and the most uncertain forces and build a matrix that shows the relevant endpoints of each of those forces and factors. So for example, if one of my factors in that industry consolidation scenario is changes in the regulatory structures governing the industry, my endpoints might be slow and fast, right? The regulatory process is moving slowly, or it's going to evolve very rapidly. And then you can use that matrix to look at all the different combinations of those behavioral endpoints for each of those 2 to 5 most critical factors. So if you have a simple matrix of just 2 factors, you've only got 4 potential combinations. If you have 5 factors, you've got 32 potential combinations, which requires a bit of somewhat subjective, frankly, picking and choosing of relevant combinations to get to your alternative futures. And then for those alternative futures that you choose to focus on, here's where the creativity aspect comes in. You can develop really rich stories that describe how that alternative future would have emerged from today's conditions using those intersections of the forces behaviors as your boundary, your framework for writing that story. And then determine what you think the implications of each of those alternative futures are for your organization, your strategy, what the implications are, and what different contingency plans could be to help your organization compete and thrive in those alternative futures. So again, what we're trying to do here is stress plausibility over probability. I tend to not assign any degree of likelihood to any of my alternative futures. I want them to be comparable and equal in terms of the plausibility that any one of them could occur based on how those key factors and forces and variables wind up behaving in the future. And you want to make sure those scenarios are internally consistent. You want to make sure you're describing that combination of those forces and factor behaviors in ways that are consistent throughout your story, throughout your narrative about the evolution of the scenario or the future. And you want to read them and make sure they logically extend from conditions present today. We want to avoid any gaps in that logic that make it hard for a consumer of these futures to see how that future could have evolved from conditions present in today's environment. So I really like this because the second aspect here on this benefit slide is it models how different factors and forces and dynamics interact with each other. A lot of times when individuals do trend forecasting, we tend to isolate a specific variable, project that into the future, and leave other important variables static in the present. And that really comes up with flawed forecasts and flawed futures thinking. because we don't appreciate how these different variables and forces and factors interact and behave with each other. So this helps us model those combinations of behavioral interactions in terms of defining what different futures could look like. Now, the other one is it provides the sixth one here, a broader analytic framework for calculating risk and opportunity. We can see in each of those futures where there's inherent opportunity for your organization, where there's inherent risk, and you can begin to build those contingency plans on those risk and opportunity conditions in each of your alternative futures. So again, a really structured creativity approach that can be really, really valuable, especially in conditions of high uncertainty. So let me wrap with this depiction of sort of where in the analytic process these techniques tend to work best. So the green bars and circles here are the techniques that we just talked about. You'll see 3 of the 4, competing hypotheses, alternative futures, and indicators of change, have a role throughout the analytic process. I often do the analysis of competing hypotheses multiple times as I'm refining my evidence set, eliminating diagnostic evidence, finding holes in my data set to be able to evaluate hypotheses with more confidence, and I'll repeat that method several times. Indicators of change has sort of an ongoing nature to it, as we discussed, as does alternative futures. The key assumptions check I find is helpful at the very beginning of a project, and as you're approaching the end, to have just that recheck on the assumptions after you first re-examined them at the beginning and have had the benefit of your intelligence gathering to then re-examine which of the remaining assumptions from the first time you did the check still are valid, or which ones might need to be challenged again or refined or eliminated. So let me stop there and open it up for another round of questions before we wrap things up in about 9 minutes time.
Great, thanks so much, Ken. Yeah, we've got some good audience questions, a few related to perhaps some of the earlier techniques. The first being, how can you unearth the unstated premise?
How can you unearth the unstated premise? Let me try to interpret that, because that question can mean a couple of different things. Well, first off, it's hard, right? Because the longer period of time that elapses between when you do a key assumptions check, which I think is what that question is probably relating to, the more ingrained those unstated premises tend to become. So it really requires some tough introspective and retrospective thinking, but that's a good opportunity, if you can, to bring people outside your organization in and cite that sort of analytic premise, your starting point for the key assumptions analysis, and ask maybe a marketing agency or an advertising partner or even a customer, whether they have any reason to believe that analytic premise to be true, and why or why not. Having that outside perspective may pinpoint those deep-seated perspectives or assumptions that have been around for so long that you've actually forgotten they exist. So I think some external looking from some of your industry partners might be a good way to get at some of those deep-seated perceptions.
That's interesting. Thanks for that perspective. Another question just on analytic techniques more generally. What is your opinion of a PEST or PESTLE, or sometimes called steeple analytic technique?
Mm-hmm. It's a great technique. Again, one I use a lot. I didn't include it. I was sort of assuming, as maybe I should have done my own key assumptions check, that's more common and more familiar to most people, and I wanted to get at a few that maybe are a bit more obscure. But again, it's a very good framework. It at least forces analysts to think about, anywhere from 4 to 6, depending on your preferred acronym and variation of that technique, in terms of the kind of external forces and factors that might impede on a particular situation. So I would certainly consider it to be complementary to each of the 4 techniques we thought about here. But that's one that you want to be careful not to overuse it. I've gotten the sense lately that PEST or STEEP or PESTLE is almost sort of that default technique that everyone's going to use in every situation, and it isn't that, right? So you just want to be careful that you are using that technique or any of these, in the right situations, which is why for these four, I tried to give a little guidance as to when is the best time to use them. But PEST, SWOT, which is I know the topic of the next webinar, the various Porter techniques, value chain, again, those are all valid techniques that I think these four are complementary with, and vice versa.
That's great, thanks. Next question. What if we miss a hypothesis and as a result fail to consider a viable explanation or conclusion related to ACH?
Yeah, good, really good question. You're going to miss a hypothesis. I mean, it's hard to be purely MECE, purely mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And so, typically when you apply that technique, a couple of things will happen, right? One, as you're evaluating evidence against hypotheses, if you find yourself with a large amount of undiagnostic evidence, in other words, evidence that isn't consistent or inconsistent and essentially has no relationship with any of your hypotheses, you can temporarily divert into a more inductive reasoning approach and say, is this data representative of some other explanation that I didn't consider in my initial hypothesis generation effort as part of this technique? And then you can add that hypothesis and go through the exercise again. Chances are you'll have fewer pieces of evidence that don't have a relationship, because one of the hypotheses will be drawn from that. And it also lets you scrutinize those inductively derived hypotheses based on the other evidence that probably didn't contribute to its development. So that's kind of the most obvious way. If you construct your ACH matrix and you're worried that your hypothesis set isn't as complete as possible, either ask again individuals who may have contributed to that hypothesis set, or perhaps run a second workshop or a second meeting, or get input from other individuals who weren't part of the first hypothesis set generation to contribute their expertise, to make sure you've got that collectively exhaustive requirement checked off.
That makes sense. And I think connects with some other questions that just came in related to the iterative nature of the process. First, starting with the right hypotheses is critical. How much time should a team invest in coming up with hypotheses, and how much do you adjust them in your process? And another attendee asked, how long do you plan for one cycle, of this throughout an analytic project?
So you're not going to like the answer. This is the classic consultant answer. It really depends. It depends on the nature of the problem you're trying to solve, right? So some problems are relatively well bounded. They're small. The forecast period or the time frame that you're trying to look out into the future is relatively limited. And those are the kinds of problems where the time it takes to generate hypotheses literally can be an hour. I mean, it can be very, very short if it's a very tightly bounded problem. And the evidence collection and process of going through the matrix and the evaluation can happen relatively quickly. It's feasible to do that literally in a day. For problems that are more complex, have more variables, are longer in time frame or duration, that's where you're looking at several hours and maybe even a couple of days to do a good job at hypothesis generation. I often like to take a break, at least maybe of an evening or perhaps a day or two after I have my first set of hypotheses generated, and then come back and revisit it after some time has passed. And similarly, the amount of time it takes to gather the intelligence to get to your evidence set can take weeks, if not months in some cases. So in that case, it could be quite long. So the cycle can be anywhere from literally a day to several months, depending on the complexity and the size of the problem.
Thanks so much, Ken. And we're coming up on time. So if you do have any additional questions, I'm sure, is it okay if people reach out to you directly?
Absolutely, and I think that handout has my contact info, but here it is as well. I'll be happy to field questions if folks have them.
Fantastic. Thank you again. And we also want to thank you, the audience, for joining and for all your participation. Don't forget, one lucky attendee will be randomly selected to win $25. So you'll receive an email from us if it's you. And this webinar has been recorded, so definitely watch for an email following the webinar with a link to the recording on SLA CIC's YouTube channel. You'll find all of our webinars there as well. And we hope you'll come back and participate in May for the next installment of the CI Toolkit series. Thank you all so much and see you next month.